Hello and welcome back, adventurers. This is Captain TTRPG, and today we're talking about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Hello and welcome back, adventurers. Today's topic is something a little different from what I normally do, but I was really inspired to do this after getting into Starfinder 2nd Edition and reading through all of the classes there. And as I was building out a lot of my class videos, which I know I haven't finished, I apologize, it's been busy, but as I was building them out, especially starting where I did, I was looking at the weapons. Particularly, I was looking at the guns. I was looking at classes that were using guns most of the time. And what I've noticed were, hey, most of these guns, you don't have to reload every shot. But surely, if you don't have to reload every single shot, then gun wielders must be way more powerful than any melee class, because I mean, isn't that what Pathfinder tells us? That we have to have this reload between every shot to tone down the power of firearms enough that it's in line with everything else. But the further I looked into the classes in Starfinder, I didn't find that to be true. It seemed like the melee classes could probably keep up pretty well. It felt fairly balanced. Not perfectly, mind you, but fairly balanced. And so it got me thinking, if this is fairly balanced over here, do we really need this mandatory one-shot reload on all firearms, minus a couple, I know there's a couple, but generally speaking, on firearms in Pathfinder 2nd Edition? Now, I didn't want to just think about this. I didn't want to just theorize and talk about that. So I went ahead and I ran some numbers. Granted, white room numbers, but I still wanted to run something to reinforce the stance that I'm trying to take here. Because I didn't go in this assuming I'd fall one way or the other, I really just wanted to understand. But after running the numbers, I definitely have an opinion. First of all, let me just say, firearms can be strong. Does that mean that they are the strongest weapons in the game in Pathfinder? No. And also, yes, kind of. So why would I say that firearms are strong, and what are they stronger than? Well, generally speaking, when we're talking about comparing weapons, we want to compare similar types of weapons, right? Firearms are a ranged projectile weapon, which means I'm comparing them originally against other ranged weapons, bows, crossbows, stuff like that, right? Hey, if you're going to be using a gun, you're probably doing it at range, just like these things. But there's also some comparisons to do with thrown weapons, because sometimes you're using shorter ranged firearms, so you might want to compare with thrown weapons. And for the heck of it, I thought I might do some comparisons against melee weapons as well, just to see how close these all land together on damage numbers, so I have a good idea. Notice that everything else I mentioned that isn't a firearm doesn't take reloading, except for crossbows, of course. But I did less comparison with the crossbows. I'll get to it. I did still bring them in here, right? Bows don't take reloading. They're reload 0. Thrown weapons, assuming they have a returning rune on them, have no reload either, and you should probably have a returning rune on your thrown weapon once you can, anyway. And of course, melee weapons don't need reloading. They can just keep swinging. So we've got a lot of non-reload options. I would assume then that because there's reload on the firearms, that if we ignore the reload, they look just entirely too powerful. But to really decide what they look like and how strong they are, I wanted to run some numbers, but before we do, let's talk about what makes firearms strong and why I'd even think that to begin with. The main trait that makes firearms strong is the fact that the majority of the really powerful firearms have the fatal or the fatal aim traits. So what are these two? Well, in case you haven't watched my video about these weapon traits, fatal, it's got a dice size with it. So let's take fatal D12. If your weapon has a trait of fatal D12, let's say that normally it does a D8 of damage. And no matter how many dice you have, they're always D8s. Well, when you critically hit with the fatal trait, it turns all of your D8s. So let's say you've got a greater striking rune, right? And you've got 3 D8s on there. It turns all of those D8s into D12s. You roll that, you add in any of the modifiers, you double that total amount, and then you roll another D12 and add it on. And that's how fatal D12 would work. Fatal aim D12 would just say, hey, you only get the fatal trait if you're using this gun in 2 hands, because there are some guns that can be used in 1 or 2 hands, and when it has one-handed, you don't get the fatal trait. When it's two-handed, you get the fatal trait. So that's all fatal aim means, is when you get the fatal trait. But still, the fatal trait massively increases the damage you do with a weapon. It's far stronger than the deadly trait. But is it too strong? And that's what kept kind of haunting me. So that's how, again, that's how the fatal trait works. Now, just to remind you how deadly works. So let's take something like the longbow, where you've got a D8 damage die, and then it's got the deadly D10 trait. When I crit with a longbow, I'm still rolling D8s, putting the modifiers, doubling that, and then adding a D10 on top, though. And that's what the deadly trait does. So it doesn't change any of your basic dice. It just adds a D10 at the end, like Fatal does at the end, but Fatal also changes all the initial dice. So Fatal is stronger than deadly. So that makes it pretty clear that firearms are going to be stronger than bows, right? But here's the other thing. We have several bows on the stronger side, in my mind, the better bows, that have another trait that makes them stronger. This other trait that's interesting is propulsive. Now, not all bows get it. The composite bows get this. The Gatgung gets this. So our stronger bows get this other trait, and they still get to keep good damage die on them. Basically, what this says is, hey, take half your strength attribute modifier and add it to the damage rolls of your bow strikes. So if I've got, again, the composite longbow here, I still have a D8 damage die, I still have the deadly D10, but I have propulsive on here. So now if I've got, say, +4 to my strength, I get a straight up +2 damage on my hits. And there is no firearm with the propulsive trait on it. So they're not going to be adding any flat modifiers on like the bows are. And flat modifiers do affect damage pretty substantially. Now, I wanted to make sure that when I was doing my calculations, I was comparing like-minded weapons, meaning good weapons from each side. So in this case, I took the Giselle, which is a really solid one or two-handed weapon. It's got the fatal aim D12 trait, and it does a D8 damage die on it, against the composite longbow. Both these have long range. Composite longbow has deadly D10, uses D8 for the normal dice, but has propulsive. Great. So bow, D8 weapon, Giselle, D8 weapon. We're going to be using both in two hands because we fire with two hands with the bow. We're going to hold Giselle there to get the fatal trait. All of that's good. Now, for the calculations I did, I just said, hey, I'm just an average martial character. Let's just take a rogue, for instance, and not worry about the sneak attack dice. So average martial character, say maximize dex. With the bow, at least, we want to make sure we got strength as our next highest attribute. So at level 1, we're talking about, for the bow, getting to add 1 flat damage on because we have a +3 strength, rounded down on the half, gives us a 1. Great. So we're going to crunch some numbers looking at level 1. Now, when I'm looking at this, I had a lot of things to put in mind, right? Look at average AC for other creatures. I did, a slightly lower level creature, level 0 creatures on average, looking at level 1 for player characters. Anyway, what this got me to was saying, for the average martial character, we probably have, for our first attack, a 50% chance to hit with a 15% chance to crit. That's on our first shot. And then, of course, we have multiple attack penalty that comes in for a second shot. And the way I calculated damage was I said, great, I'm going to assume 2 attacks per turn. Why 2 attacks? I'm assuming you want to do something else with your third action, whether it be move around or, intimidate or whatever you're doing. Probably saying 2 actions plus a third attack on a round because of multiple attack penalty isn't great. So for this kind of white room numbers exercise I did here, we're going to be using 2 attacks each round. We are, of course, including multiple attack penalty in there, but I'm not assuming any reloading on your gun. I'm going to say, no, there's no reloading. So every turn, we can take 2 shots without reloading. Keep in mind, I'm not recommending in this video that we never reload guns, but we'll get there. I just want to talk about taking, these 2 weapons side by side with no other blockers. How does that damage play out? Are guns just that much stronger? And the truth is, after running some damage, and I'll put it up here on screen, you can see some calculations I did, so you can call me out on the bad math, and you can see the numbers I got to. When it came right down to it, the bow actually does a better job than the gun when you put all the damage together. And the reason for this is the guns are so heavily weighted toward crits that their normal damage suffers compared to a bow like I've got here. Even with that +1 damage modifier on it, that makes a huge difference. We just aren't getting that from the gun. And so the bows, as long as they have propulsive, actually kind of outpace the gun on average damage. Now, on a crit, on a single crit, there's no doubt the gun hits harder, right? It's going to hit really hard on those crit moments. But on turn after turn, adding up the average damage, the bows actually outplay what the gun can do. And then as we move up, I ran numbers at level 5 as well. You can see that we've got an attribute increase. Now we get a +2 added to our damage from our strength modifier, because with level 5 we can up our strength to a +4. That's actually separating us slightly more. And again, this also is affected by crit chance, so that plays in here. But it means that they're not that far apart, right? If our average damage from the bow is slightly higher, but the crits from the gun are slightly more, they're fairly well balanced. And I don't think that's a bad thing. But if they're fairly well balanced, and maybe it's not a lot stronger having a gun or a bow than the other one, it does bring this back into question. Do we need the constant reloading? But I felt like that wasn't quite enough, just those two weapons against each other. So I wanted to do a few other comparisons. So yes, we talked about composite bow and the Jezzail, but I wanted to put in some other types of weaponry here, right? So one thing we've got our thrown weapons. And by that I mean straight thrown weapons where they only have a thrown range, they don't have in melee. And then a melee weapon that has the thrown property, because that's another way we can do some thrown stuff. And I'm going to compare those this time against something that's more their range, which is the dueling pistol. And I thought for good measure, let's go ahead and throw in the composite short bow, which has a shorter range, has deadly D10 and propulsive. Great. Now that dueling pistol is a D6, just like the short bow, but it has the fatal D10 trait, so it still has fatal D10, also concussive and concealable, but they don't affect damage. Now the other weapons I chose are the Chakram, which is a D8 20-foot thrown weapon, which is very strong. And then we have the melee weapon with the thrown property of the Mambele, which is a 1d6 deadly D8 disarm thrown 20-foot weapon. So I ran the numbers for all of these. Now keep in mind, thrown weapons, they get to add all of your strength as damage on a hit. Okay, so we saw that partial strength on a hit helped a lot because it's flat damage. So does this increase it even more? Well, yes, definitely, it absolutely does. When you run the flat numbers, you see that the Mambele is just going to hit the hardest here. It's got the deadly D8 trait on it, and it's got thrown 20 feet. Great, so it's adding all of our strength, and it's got the deadly trait on a crit. It's combining all the best worlds together. It just hits the hardest. Now, when we look at the difference in average damage on a round between the Mambele and the lowest damage per round on average weapon, which is the dueling pistol, we're talking about 3 damage on average a turn. The max damage possible with a single attack is still the dueling pistol, but not by a ton. And again, these numbers are they pale in comparison to what melee weapons could do. So I haven't even talked about that because I didn't really want to get in there. When I ran the numbers for melee weapons, I'm going to have a whole other conversations about melee weapons and classes. But when I ran the numbers for melee weapons, none of these ranged weapons get anywhere near if we're taking 2 actions to strike with melee weapons. Strength-based melee weapons, but still. When I'm hitting with big D12 or D10 damage weapons with their traits, those are just blowing these out of the water. So I didn't even want to bring that really in here. And they shouldn't be compared because, again, these weapons you can fire from further away. Melee weapons, I got to get right up on there. I'm having to move a lot more. All the caveats that go with that. But that's all to say, the firearms are never standing out as overly powerful, and I'm never making them reload in my White Room sessions here. Right? I'm just saying we're taking 2 shots per round every time without breaking. How does that look? And time again, with all the numbers I run, it's fine. Every time, yes, they stand out on a crit. We don't crit all the time in Pathfinder's Recognition. Now, we crit more than you do in something like D&D, because you don't have to roll a 20 to crit, right? We have higher crit ranges, and some classes have much higher crit ranges. But even when I put in some extra crit range, it's not like they fly above. I ran a few experiments with higher crit ranges, up to like 25 or even 30%, and again, the composite bow and Jezzail on that one, but still, their average damages still stayed pretty much the same. You know, the higher crit chance we go, finally, eventually the Jezzail gets above, but it takes a while and they stay comparable. But I don't want to ignore the fact that everything I've talked about so far has been White Room style numbers, right? Nothing really works like that. You've got a lot of other feats, things you're doing other than striking, so I don't want to pretend like everything's White Room. That's not how it works. So let's go ahead and take a look at the most common class to use a firearm, and that is the Gunslinger. So at the Gunslinger, we've got some feats that were built with the need to reload in mind. So we've got feats that allow you to move while reloading, to take certain actions while reloading, you know, whether it's demoralize or striding. You can do all these things while you reload to help deal with the action economy of the fact that you have to reload. And then we've got interesting feats like Black Powder Boost that seem to have been built around the idea that, yes, you can do this cool thing because you're going to have to reload afterward because you had to use up what was in the chamber in order to get this cool jump out of it. Having looked through all the feats to the class, they kind of fall into two categories if we only had to reload the firearms, say, every 3 to 6 shots rather than every shot. Either they become slightly lower value because, well, you know, they're usually action economy things, so I can stride while I reload it. Okay, it's still useful, but it's got lower value because I'm not having to use it as much. Or they just increase the power, and you might need to force a reload after using them, which is what we see with something with Black Powder Boost. Like, okay, normally you'd only reload every 6 shots, but if you Black Powder Boost, you have to reload afterward, or else maybe it was too strong. I don't see any feats that simply become pointless or would break completely if we could take more shots before reloading. And obviously, gunslingers aren't the only class that utilize firearms, but given the focus, this is the most likely to break guns if a class was going to break guns by not having to reload all the time. Now, the other question we might ask when looking at Gunslinger is, if no longer required to reload nearly as often, is the increased proficiency a problem? So in the number crunching I did earlier, I assumed that the weapon wielders were used by just any random class and it wasn't a separation, right? So if we do a comparison between, say, a ranger and a gunslinger, we do see a change. In that case, the average damage from the firearm does, in fact, again, move beyond the bow because we've got that higher crit chance versus the lower crit chance that another martial has, yet it's still not by a lot. It's, you know, by like 1 damage on average. Yes, the critical hits still stand out a lot, and yes, they have a higher chance to crit, but it doesn't change our overall average damage that we're pumping out by a ton. But having gunslingers in multiple games, I will say that what makes gunslingers really good is that first shot each turn, right? And while you might occasionally see a gunslinger unable to take a shot on a given round due to the need to reload, it's actually pretty rare. Given the range and ability to keep enemies much further than arm's length, I feel like those rounds without a shot occur because the players want to use other cool feats, right? They might want to use like creating a smoke curtain or casting a spell with a free archetype or something, and that's why they're not taking a shot. So maybe sometimes you'd get to shoot when you otherwise wouldn't be able to, but even adding that in, it's not going to have them overshadow others with their damage by the calculations I'm running here. All of this put together is to say that in my experience, which certainly won't match that of others, gunslingers, the most likely to break guns, aren't breaking the game with firearms and still wouldn't even if the firearms didn't require constant reloading. And if the firearms aren't breaking in the hands of gunslingers, is anybody going to break them? And I would say no. So I decided to go ahead and put this into practice. I decided both games, since they both have gunslingers, I'm going to say, all right, I looked at the weapons, and I gave each weapon a certain number of shots they get to take before they reload. It varied based on the weapons that they were using. But when looking at them and giving them those, in neither case did they overshadow the other martials in play. Yes, they got a few more shots off than usual. Yes, they did a little more average damage, but they still felt very much the same, only without this kind of negative feeling they had from having to constantly reload and needing to think about how they fit their play around that one reload every single time. Instead, they had a little more freedom, but they still had to reload. They still had to plan it out. They just got a little more freedom certain turns. And I would say that the overall feel was certainly better. So my conclusion out of all this is that when I look at Starfinder 2nd Edition, it doesn't look broken because it's actually not. Because having to reload every shot is not necessary to keep firearms in line with other martial weapons. They stay in line pretty well already. It's just not the big deal it originally looks like it is. And that's why I think it's completely reasonable to say we could have each firearm have a different reload, just like we see in Starfinder, and it really won't affect much. That 6-shooter, it's probably even fine to give them 6 shots before they have to reload. That might be completely fine. They're not going to overshadow your other martials. It's going to feel okay. Sure, maybe if they've got something like a sniper rifle on them that's got this massive range, has the Fatal D12 on there, okay, maybe you do make them reload every single shot, or every 2 shots, or whatever. But I think there's a lot more play here, and I do think that'll help the characters trying to use them feel a lot better about pulling them into the game. Because right now, it is an overhead that is hard for almost any class to deal with, including the Gunslinger, and I just don't think they're going to break the game. What do you think? Have you had games where Gunslingers are just way more powerful than everybody else and just putting all their numbers to shame? Do you feel like if we don't make them reload every time, that we've just opened up the game to too much power creep? Do you feel like, I don't know, it should take 2 actions to reload a firearm? Give me your thoughts in the comments below, and as always, adventure on.